The medieval battlefield was a place of brutal predictability. For centuries, the armored knight reigned supreme, his steel-plated body a fortress, his warhorse a thunderous engine of destruction. Battles were a contest of valor and physical strength, their outcomes often shaped by the brute force of cavalry charges and the swordsmanship of elite warriors. Chivalry was not just a code of honor, it was the glue that held the martial world together. The battlefield was a knight's stage, and his armor and training were his ticket to glory or death. But in the early Middle Ages, this seemingly eternal order began to crack, not under the force of a siege engine or a secret alchemical discovery, but because of a weapon that looked almost childish compared to the spectacle of mounted combat. It was small enough to be carried by a peasant, simple enough to be mastered in days, and yet lethal enough to punch a hole straight through a knight's armor at a distance. Its name was the crossbow, and its quiet twang would echo through the centuries as the death knell of an entire era. To understand the shock it delivered to medieval warfare, imagine a nobleman, raised from birth to believe in the sanctity of his lineage and the impregnability of his armor, suddenly realizing he could be felled by a farmhand standing 100 yards away. Not in noble single combat, but with a single pull of a trigger. The arrival of the crossbow didn't just disrupt tactics, it violated the very psychology of war. A knight could prepare his whole life for combat, perform feats of strength, align himself with God and king. And it could all be taken from him by a weapon that required no chivalry, no training in the arts of war, just a steady aim and the squeeze of a lever. The battlefield felt different now. It felt unfair. For the first time, the knight's armor, once the ultimate symbol of safety, became a trap. The walls of steel that had promised survival now hid a terrible vulnerability, a tiny opening, a weakened seam, a flaw in the forge. This was the beginning of a slow but unstoppable unraveling. The old order, the one where nobility and warfare were intertwined, began to look fragile. Warriors who had lived by the sword now lived in fear of bolts made of wood and iron. Behind them, in the villages and camps, new kinds of soldiers emerged, men who did not need to be noble or strong to change the outcomes of battles. The crossbow democratized death. To grasp the scale of this disruption, we must step onto the fields of Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. The chants of priests still echoed over marching armies. Heraldry still gleamed in the sun. Yet whispers spread in taverns, in council halls, in the barracks. There is a weapon that can kill the unkillable. Kings debated its use. The Pope condemned it. Chronicles recorded moments when entire cavalries, proud, decorated, and confident, were cut down by volleys of bolts before their lances were even lowered. And so the medieval world stood at a crossroads. On one side was the old way, upheld by honor, bloodlines, and tradition. On the other was the future, a world where technology, not birthright, dictated who lived and who died. But who created this weapon? Why did it terrify even the bravest warriors? And what does its story tell us about how power shifts, suddenly, brutally, and irrevocably? That story begins not with kings or knights, but with engineers and craftsmen. With the quiet rhythm of wood being shaped, sinew being stretched, and iron being sharpened. With the rise of a weapon born in the shadows, stepping into the light, ready to rewrite the rules of war. Long before it terrified the armored nobility of Europe, the crossbow had already lived a long and storied life in the East. Its earliest forms appeared in ancient China as far back as the 5th century BCE, where it was used not by individual heroes but by organized armies who valued its precision and deadly efficiency. The Chinese perfected trigger mechanisms made of bronze, enabling mass production and deployment on a scale unmatched by any Western kingdom at the time. These ancient engineers understood a core principle that would later unsettle the knights of Europe. Force doesn't need to come from muscle alone. It can be stored, released, and amplified through ingenious mechanisms. And even a weak arm can wield immense power with the right tool. By the time the crossbow reached Europe, likely through trade routes and wars of expansion, it encountered a continent where feudal loyalties and martial honor were deeply entrenched. In the 11th and 12th centuries, European craftsmen adapted and simplified the design, introducing wooden stocks and steel bow limbs to increase both power and ease of use. The weapon's genius lay in its brutal simplicity. It required no years of training like the longbow, no noble upbringing like the sword. A crossbowman could be a butcher, a farmer, a runaway serf. Within days, he could learn to load the bolt, crank the string, and fire with lethal accuracy. War, once the playground of the elite, was now within reach of the common man. The psychological shift was profound. Armies could now be bulked up quickly with infantrymen wielding crossbows, opening warfare to a new class of fighters. It was not just the lethality of the crossbow that alarmed the ruling powers, it was what it represented, the erosion of traditional hierarchies. The rules were changing, not by decree of king or council, but by the quiet innovation of craftsmen and the cold logic of efficiency on the battlefield. Knights returning from the Crusades were some of the first to face the crossbow in deadly earnest. They had gone to the Holy Land expecting glorious charges and honorable combat, only to find that Muslim and Byzantine armies were already well-versed in ranged warfare. From city walls and fortified towers, crossbowmen rained bolts with unerring precision. The Crusaders learned a painful truth: courage meant little against the pull of a trigger. But the real fear began when the crossbow came home. Soon, every battlefield in Europe featured men armed with this compact, devastating device. They formed units behind wooden pavises, tower shields that offered protection while reloading, and sent wave after wave of bolts into advancing cavalry. Knights, accustomed to towering over the battlefield, suddenly found themselves powerless against an enemy they often couldn't reach in time. Plate armor, once their greatest advantage, became a slow, creaking prison. The threat was so great that in the year 1139, at the Second Lateran Council, Pope Innocent II issued a decree that labeled the crossbow hateful to God and banned its use against fellow Christians. But as with many such condemnations, the ban was more symbolic than effective. Rulers and generals continued to employ crossbowmen, especially in sieges and open battles where their power could not be ignored. The Church's ban did, however, reveal something deeper, a growing fear that warfare was slipping out of the moral and ideological control of religious and secular authorities alike. In the decades that followed, crossbows evolved into even deadlier variants. Steel bows replaced wood and sinew, cranks and windlasses made loading easier, and trigger mechanisms became more refined. Crossbow bolts could pierce chainmail, helmets, and eventually even plate harness. And with each innovation, the power balance between knight and peasant tilted further. It was no longer a question of whether the crossbow would change warfare. It already had. The real question was how the knightly class would respond. And as history would show, they did not go quietly. Yet amid the rising tension, another force stirred on the battlefield. The common soldier, once a tool of nobles, now held in his hands the ability to decide the fate of lords and kings. The age of the armored knight was under siege, not by armies of equals, but by the very people they once believed would never challenge their place in the world. The rise of the crossbowman was unlike anything Europe had seen before. He was not born into knighthood, nor did he spend a lifetime learning weaponry. He was often a peasant, a laborer, someone who had never imagined himself deciding the fate of battles. And yet here he was, with a weapon that could humble the noblest warrior. This sudden elevation didn't just transform the battlefield, it transformed the social imagination of Europe. In the hands of a crossbowman, a bolt was not just a weapon, it was a challenge to centuries of inherited power. Training for crossbowmen was practical, focused, and swift. Unlike English longbowmen, who required lifelong conditioning, a crossbowman could be prepared in mere weeks. He learned to wind the string using a belt hook or windlass, place the bolt, sight the target, and fire. He didn't need the strength to draw a massive bow. He needed patience, a steady grip, and the discipline to follow orders. The simplicity of the crossbow meant entire regiments of these men could be raised quickly, armed cheaply, and deployed in mass formations that could shred even the most disciplined cavalry. Nowhere was the crossbowman more feared or respected than in the city-states of northern Italy and southern France. Among them, the Genoese crossbowmen stood at the top. These professional soldiers trained from youth, carried advanced gear, and often entered battle with heavy pavis shields for cover. A single volley from a Genoese company could break the charge of even the most hardened knights, turning what should have been a glorious advance into a scene of chaos and death. But the life of a crossbowman was far from easy. He might be despised by knights who saw him as cowardly or dishonorable. Medieval chronicles often describe crossbowmen as mechanical men, fighters who used machinery to kill rather than true prowess. And yet, when war came, it was these mechanical men who were sent to the front lines, expected to stand firm as waves of armored killers bore down upon them. Their wooden shields were their only protection. Their stamina, their only armor. Under the roar of battle, they learned to load and fire faster, adjust their aim instinctively, and pray that no lance or sword found its way through the gaps in the line. Yet their rise marked a crucial shift. Warfare was becoming less about individual heroics and more about coordinated strategy and technology. Crossbow units were placed strategically alongside pikemen and infantry, supporting sieges and defending walls. They turned battles into deadly calculations of timing and terrain. Every bolt released was a reminder that war had changed, that valor alone was no longer enough. And still, the story of the crossbowman wasn't just one of empowerment. It was also one of burden. For while the knights had their oaths and their honor, the crossbowman had only the cold logic of survival. His weapon gave him power but also made him a target for hatred and retribution. He walked a thin line between scorn and necessity, between obscurity and historical memory. As the 14th century dawned, this new kind of soldier stood ready on the fields of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. And soon, at a place called Crécy, he and his weapon would be put to the ultimate test, a clash that would seal the fate of the medieval knight forever. The year was 1346, and the fields near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu in northern France were about to become the stage for one of the most decisive and transformative battles in medieval history. The 100 Years' War was in full swing, a struggle between the kingdoms of England and France fueled by dynastic rivalries and national ambition. On one side stood the English army, led by King Edward III, whose tactical brilliance and innovative strategies would soon become legend. On the other, the mighty French forces commanded by King Philip VI, bolstered by the most elite cavalry in Europe and the formidable Genoese crossbowmen. Both sides believed they could dictate the outcome of the war, but only one would reshape the very nature of combat. The English army, though smaller in number, had chosen its ground with care. Edward III's men occupied a slope, perfect for a defensive stand. His forces were a blend of armored knights dismounted to fight on foot, sturdy infantry, and thousands of longbowmen. These archers, trained from youth and capable of firing 6 arrows a minute, stood behind wooden stakes driven into the earth, ready to unleash a storm of missile fire. The longbow's range and speed made it a terror on the battlefield, and the English knew how to use it with ruthless efficiency. The French, confident in their superiority, marched forward with all the pomp and thunder of feudal might. Their army was vast, perhaps twice the size of the English, and at its core were the knights, armored, mounted, and unshakable in their belief that a charge of heavy cavalry could break any line. But King Philip, in his eagerness, ordered the battle to begin before his men were even properly organized. The Genoese crossbowmen, who had traveled long and hard, arrived exhausted and without their protective pavises. They were sent forward anyway, expected to advance into a storm of arrows. As they raised their crossbows and began to fire, they quickly realized the hopelessness of their position. The English longbows outranged the crossbows, and their rate of fire was unmatched. Arrows fell like rain, striking men and horses alike. The Genoese tried to fall back, only to be met by their own frustrated cavalry, who accused them of cowardice. In the chaos, the French knights charged forward, straight through their retreating crossbowmen, trampling them underfoot as they surged up the hill toward the English line. What followed was a massacre. The English archers, protected and calm, loosed volley after volley. Horses screamed. Men fell. Armor, once the knight's greatest strength, became his undoing. A wounded knight, encased in steel, could not rise. The mud and blood that clogged the fields became death traps. And still the English fired, stepping carefully around the stakes, directing their arrows into the dense press of men and beasts. The French charges, repeated again and again, broke apart under the relentless hail. Amid the chaos, the cry of "St. George for England!" could be heard from the English lines. The tide of battle was irrevocably turning. French nobility, countless barons, dukes, and knights, fell in the mud, their banners trampled, their bodies piled upon one another. Among the dead lay King John of Bohemia, a blind monarch who had been led into battle by his retainers, refusing to be denied a warrior's death. The sun began to set, casting a crimson glow over the carnage. By nightfall, the French army was shattered. Thousands lay dead or dying. English losses were minimal. The shockwaves reverberated across Europe, but nowhere more painfully than among the French aristocracy. The Battle of Crécy was not just a military defeat, it was the symbolic death of the medieval knight's supremacy. A new era of warfare had arrived, and the longbow and crossbow had carried it in on their string. In the aftermath of the battle, chroniclers wrote of the devastation and the unparalleled efficiency of English firepower. The traditional code of chivalry had been broken not by dishonorable treachery, but by innovation, coordination, and the cold reality of modernized warfare. The battlefield, once ruled by honor and bloodline, now bowed to the forces of strategy and technology. No one could deny it now. The age of the knight was ending, not with a sword thrust, but with the quiet release of thousands of arrows and bolts. The crossbow, once feared, had now proven its place in history, not just as a weapon, but as a herald of change. And in its wake, nothing about war would ever be the same. The horror of Crécy echoed across the courts and battlefields of Europe, igniting a desperate attempt to reclaim control over a changing world. The crossbow, once merely a tool of hunters and mercenaries, was now a symbol of disorder, a weapon that threatened not just armies, but the very foundations of medieval society. As bodies of fallen nobles were gathered from the field, the question that lingered in the minds of the powerful was this: could the tide of technological change be held back by decree, tradition, or fear? The Church certainly tried. Centuries earlier, in 1139, the Second Lateran Council had already declared the crossbow hateful to God and banned its use against Christians. This wasn't just religious rhetoric, it was an attempt to preserve the social order. The crossbow's ability to empower peasants and foot soldiers defied the divine right of the nobility. It made warfare less about noble blood and more about the pull of a trigger. But while the Church's decree was intended to draw a moral line in the sand, war cared very little for morality. Within decades of the decree, rulers across Europe were hiring crossbowmen in droves. From the Genoese companies employed by the French to the Flemish militias guarding their cities, the crossbow had become too useful to abandon. Even the Pope himself used crossbowmen to guard the Papal States. The ban, meant to curb the weapon's influence, only highlighted its growing indispensability. Yet the Church wasn't wrong to fear it. The crossbow opened the door to even deadlier innovations. The use of mechanical force to enhance penetration power inspired the development of early firearms and advancements in siege warfare. New lever devices allowed for quicker reloads. Metal bolts were developed to pierce thicker armor. And soon, primitive gunpowder weapons began appearing alongside crossbows on the battlefield, ushering in an era where weapons grew deadlier by the decade. Those who clung to the old order found themselves increasingly outmatched. Knights still trained, practiced jousting, and held tournaments. They still preached honor and courage. But their armor grew heavier, more cumbersome, in a doomed attempt to keep up with the increasing lethality of ranged weapons. Their horses wore plate barding. Their helmets became elaborate cages of steel. And yet, for every pound of protection they added, crossbow bolts and gunpowder found new ways to punch through. In castles and courts, a quieter conflict unfolded. Traditionalists argued that ranged weapons removed the honor from combat. They were tools of cowards and assassins, not true warriors. Progressive commanders countered that honor didn't matter when an enemy was storming your walls or raiding your fields. Victory mattered. Survival mattered. War was no longer a stage for noble performance. It had become a crucible of practicality. And so the medieval world stood divided, between those who sought to restrain the crossbow with moral law, and those who embraced it as the inevitable future, between knights who clung to their swords, and princes who paid for bolts and bowstrings, between a fading age of valor and the harsh dawn of calculated violence. Even as the church tried to silence it, even as aristocrats scorned it, the crossbow continued to evolve, and so did the men who wielded it. Like the first cracks in a dam, it showed that power could slip from the hands of the few and into the grip of the many. It wasn't just a weapon of war, it was a symbol of shifting power, a quiet rebellion forged in wood and iron. But the true legacy of the crossbow wouldn't be written immediately. Its final victory came not in a single battle or papal decree, but in the slow march of time, as warfare itself transformed into something colder, more efficient, and ultimately, more deadly. The world was changing. The question was not whether the knights could stop it, but whether anyone could. The crossbow's shadow stretches far beyond the medieval battlefield. Though it may seem primitive today, its impact on warfare was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, a weapon allowed ordinary men to strike down armored elites from a distance, breaking the monopoly of power held by the nobility. It transformed not just how battles were fought, but who held the power to fight them. The crossbow set in motion a pattern we still recognize: technology disrupting hierarchy. Its mechanical precision paved the way for firearms, rifles, and eventually modern ballistics. Every sniper rifle and missile system owes something to the crossbow's core principle, that stored kinetic force could level the playing field between weak and strong, rich and poor, noble and peasant. But its legacy wasn't merely technological. Emotionally and culturally, the crossbow haunted the European imagination. It exposed the fragility of old systems, forcing rulers to face a world where inherited privilege no longer guaranteed invincibility. The Church's attempt to ban it revealed not divine outrage, but fear of a future where control slipped away with every tightened string and loosed bolt. The story of the crossbow is a reminder: no power is permanent. Every age has its knights, believing themselves untouchable until a new crossbow appears. In our time, it may not be a weapon of wood and steel, but an algorithm, a drone, a line of code. The lesson is clear: innovation will always favor the bold, and history remembers those who adapt, not those who cling to the past.